On February 16, 1862, 7:30 in the morning, a freezing cold Tennessee, a Confederate general had just sent a desperate message requesting honorable surrender terms. The response he received in just 27 minutes would not only forever change the course of the American Civil War, but would prove that Ulysses S. Grant was not just another general, but a force of nature the Confederates didn't yet understand. What happened in those 27 fateful minutes? Bruce Catton, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who had access to documents no one else saw, uncovered in Grant Moves South details that will leave you in absolute shock. Because what Grant did in those minutes wasn't just a military decision. It was a declaration of war against 200 years of European military tradition and chivalry. And I'm going to tell you this story exactly as Catton discovered it, word for word, document by document, witness by witness, because when you understand what really happened in those 27 minutes, you'll realize you were looking at the birth of a new way of waging war, a way that still defines military conflicts today. But before I unveil this response that shook the military world, you need to understand who Grant truly was at that moment, because what Bruce Catton discovered in his years of research goes against everything you think you know about this man. Let me give you 5 shocking insights that Catton exposed about Grant at Fort Donelson. First, Grant had been in active military command for only 8 months after years of selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis, but he had already developed a strategy that terrified his own allies. Catton discovered that Grant didn't follow any traditional military manuals. He was inventing his own rules. Second, he made a decision at Fort Donelson that violated all the rules of military chivalry of the time, and Catton proves through personal letters that this was completely intentional. Grant knew exactly what he was doing. Third, the famous phrase "unconditional surrender" was not planned. It was an instinctive reaction that revealed something terrible and fascinating about Grant's true personality. Catton had access to the diaries of the officers who were in the tent, and what they described will send a shiver down your spine. Fourth, Grant was being spied on by his own superiors at that moment. Generals in Washington who doubted his abilities, and he knew it. The decision at Fort Donelson was also a message to them. Fifth, there is a secret letter Grant wrote to his wife Julia 3 days after Fort Donelson. A letter Catton found in the family's personal archives, where Grant admits something about those 27 minutes that will completely change your view of him. And all of this happened in just 27 minutes that defined the fate of a nation. Stay until the end, because I'm going to reveal not only the exact response Grant wrote, word for word, but I'll also tell you what happened when that response reached the Confederate general's hands, and why it was so devastating that it changed the way wars are fought to this day. To understand the magnitude of those 27 minutes, I need to take you to the brutal winter of 1862. Bruce Catton describes in Grant Moves South a scene that seemed impossible to happen in America. It was February. The country had been torn apart for almost a year by the Civil War, and until that moment, battles followed a classic European pattern. Gentlemen fought with honor, prisoners were treated with respect, surrenders were negotiated with dignity. It was almost like a duel between aristocrats magnified to thousands of men. Grant had just captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River in just 6 days, but Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River was completely different. It was the key to Nashville, the beating heart of the Confederate South. Catton describes that whoever controlled Fort Donelson would control the waterways that supplied the South. It was literally the vital artery of the Confederacy. Catton reveals through military documents that Grant knew he had only a microscopic window of opportunity. The Confederates were sending massive reinforcements from all over the region. The winter was so brutal that soldiers were dying of cold in the trenches, and his superiors in Washington were starting to seriously doubt his aggressive and unorthodox tactics. General Henry Halleck, Grant's superior, was receiving political pressure to control this reckless drunkard who was making military decisions without prior authorization. Catton had access to the communications between Halleck and Washington, and they show that Grant was literally fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the Confederates in front of him, and against his own superiors behind his back. But what makes Fort Donelson even more fascinating is that Grant would face something Catton called the ultimate test of military character. Because at Fort Donelson, Grant would not just face enemy soldiers, he would face an old personal friend, someone he had known since the West Point Military Academy, someone who expected to be treated with the courtesy and respect that decades of friendship deserved. And it was in this context of political pressure, military urgency, and personal friendship that what Bruce Catton classified as the moment that defined not only Grant, but the future of modern warfare happened. Bruce Catton spent years studying Grant's psychology, and what he discovered is absolutely fascinating. Grant was not the typical general you imagine. He was something completely new in American military history. Catton had access to Grant's personal diaries, the letters he wrote to his wife Julia, the accounts of officers who lived with him daily, and through these documents, he built a psychological portrait of Grant that is both impressive and disturbing. Grant was a man who had failed at practically everything in civilian life. He tried to be a farmer. He failed. He tried to be a businessman. He failed. He tried to sell firewood on the streets of St. Louis, and he even did that poorly. Catton found records that Grant was known in the city as the man who can't even sell firewood right. But when the Civil War began, something awakened in Grant. Something Catton describes as an almost supernatural ability to make impossible decisions without hesitation. It was as if all the frustrations, all the failures, all the humiliation of civilian life had been transformed into absolute military determination. Catton reveals that Grant developed a unique military philosophy. He believed that war should not be a gentleman's game, but a matter of life and death where only one side could survive. And this was not just a military strategy, it was a deep personal conviction. The officers who served with Grant described him as eerily calm during battles, but also cold as ice when making decisions about human lives. Catton found an account from a colonel who said, Grant decided on the death of thousands of men with the same naturalness as he chose what to eat for breakfast. And there was something else, something Catton discovered through personal letters. Grant had an almost obsessive need to prove to himself that he wasn't the failure he had been in civilian life. Every military victory was not just a strategic achievement, it was a desperate personal validation. Catton explains that this combination, personal failure, transformed into military determination, emotional coldness, combined with a need for validation, created a type of general the world had never seen before. A man capable of making decisions that others would consider unthinkable, and executing them without a second's hesitation. And it was this man, with this complex and ruthless psychology, who wrote that 28-word letter in just 27 minutes, forever changing the nature of modern warfare. Bruce Catton details minute by minute what happened on that freezing cold morning of February 16th, and the precision of the details is astonishing. Catton had access to the diaries of at least a dozen different officers, the official reports, the personal letters, and was able to reconstruct that day with an almost cinematic precision. 4 a.m. Grant wakes up in his tent. According to the account of his personal assistant, he hadn't slept more than 2 hours in the last 48 hours. Catton found a letter Grant wrote days later describing that he felt a weight in my chest, as if something definitive was about to happen. 4:30 a.m. The first reports arrive that the Confederates attempted a desperate escape during the night. Grant reads the reports in absolute silence, makes no comment, just shakes his head slowly. 5 a.m. Grant summons his generals for an emergency meeting. Catton had access to the notes that General John McClernand made of that meeting, and they reveal that Grant said only one sentence. They tried to escape and failed. Now let's finish this. 5:30 a.m. Reports arrive confirming that the Confederate escape attempt was a complete disaster. Thousands of Confederate soldiers died trying to break through the Union lines. Grant receives this news without showing any emotion, just orders to prepare for a possible surrender. 6 a.m. Grant receives the news that General John B. Floyd, the Confederate commander, abandoned his troops during the night and escaped by boat down the Cumberland River. Catton describes that when Grant heard this, his reaction was one of absolute contempt. Grant reportedly said, "A coward who abandons his men does not deserve to be called a general." 6:30 a.m. Reports arrive that Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest escaped during the night with all his cavalry. About 700 men, crossing frozen swamps in the dark. Grant, according to Catton, respected Forrest as a soldier, but was furious that another commander had abandoned his subordinates. 7 a.m. Grant receives official confirmation. Only General Simon Bolivar Buckner remains in command of the Confederate forces at Fort Donelson, and at this moment, according to Catton, Grant realized he would face a psychologically complex situation. Because Buckner was not just an enemy general, he was an old friend from West Point. Catton discovered through personal letters that Grant and Buckner had a history that went far beyond the military academy. Years before the war, when Grant was going through financial difficulties in New York, it was Buckner who lent him money so he could go home. Grant never forgot that kindness, and now he was facing the man who had helped him in one of the most difficult moments of his life. 7:15 a.m., Grant is left alone in his tent, according to witnesses, pacing back and forth, clearly thinking intensely about something. Catton speculates that Grant was dealing with the conflict between personal gratitude and military necessity. 7:30 a.m., a white flag arrives, and with it, an official letter from General Buckner requesting honorable surrender terms. Grant reads the letter twice, then places it on the table, and stares at it in absolute silence for several minutes. And it was at this moment, this exact moment, that Grant made the decision that Bruce Catton called the turning point not only of the battle, but of the entire war, and possibly of modern military history. Catton had access not only to the official letters, but to the accounts of witnesses who were in the tent with Grant during those 27 crucial minutes. And what he discovered is extraordinary, because those 27 minutes reveal not just a military decision, but a complete psychological transformation. When Grant finished reading Buckner's letter for the second time, he called his assistant and asked for paper, ink, and a writing surface. According to the witness's account, Grant said, "I need absolute silence for the next few minutes." Catton describes that Grant was alone, looking at Buckner's letter, and you need to understand what Buckner had written. Buckner's letter followed all the traditions of military chivalry of the time. He acknowledged the superiority of the Union forces, expressed respect for Grant's command, and requested honorable and just surrender terms, including the possibility for his officers to keep their personal weapons and horses, and for the troops to be treated as honored prisoners of war. It was a perfectly courteous letter, written by one gentleman to another gentleman, expecting the traditional response of an officer educated at West Point. Buckner was following a military protocol that had existed for centuries, but Grant, according to Catton, was not thinking about protocols or traditions. Grant was thinking about something much deeper and more disturbing. Catton had access to Grant's personal diaries written years after the war, where Grant admitted that in those 27 minutes he made a conscious decision to break forever with the past. Grant realized that this war could not be won by following old rules, that the Confederacy was a rebellion that needed to be completely crushed, not respectfully negotiated with, and there was something else, something personal that Catton discovered through intimate letters. Grant was thinking about all the failures in his life, about all the times he was too kind, too respectful, too diplomatic, and that had resulted in one failure after another. In those 27 minutes, Grant decided that he would never be kind again when victory was within reach. Catton describes that Grant picked up the pen and began to write, not a diplomatic response, not a chivalrous negotiation, but something that would shock the military world. The witness who was in the tent reported that Grant wrote without pauses, without hesitation, as if the words were already fully formed in his mind. He wrote for exactly 6 minutes, then reread it once, then folded the paper and handed it over to be sent immediately. Total, 27 minutes from the moment he received Buckner's letter to the moment he sent his response. And that response of just 28 words would destroy 200 years of European military tradition, and a new kind of war would be born. A total war, a war without chivalry, a war where only one side would survive. Bruce Catton reproduces in Grant Moves South not only the letter Grant sent, but also the reactions of every person who read it, from the messenger who delivered it to the Confederate generals who received it, to the politicians in Washington who learned about it days later. Let me read the full response that Grant sent to Buckner. General, no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant, Brigadier General Commanding. That was all. 28 words that changed history. But you need to understand, Catton explains that every word of that letter was carefully chosen to cause maximum psychological impact. Let's analyze it phrase by phrase. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. This phrase destroyed centuries of military tradition. In all previous wars, surrenders were negotiated, terms were discussed. Dignity was preserved. Grant was saying, there is no negotiation, there is no dignity, there is no tradition, there is only one option, complete surrender. "I propose to move immediately upon your works." This was not just a military threat, it was a personal threat. Grant was saying that if Buckner didn't surrender immediately, he would order a total attack that would result in a complete massacre. It was a threat of military genocide. "I am, sir, very respectfully, your obedient servant." And here is the cruelest part. Grant ended with the traditional courteous formality, as if he hadn't just sent a brutal ultimatum. It was almost a mockery of military tradition. Catton describes the reaction of the messenger who delivered the letter. A young Confederate lieutenant who expected to return with honorable surrender terms for his comrades. When he read the letter, according to witnesses, he turned as pale as paper, trembling, unable to believe what he was reading. Buckner's reaction was even more dramatic. Catton had access to Buckner's personal memoirs written years after the war, where Buckner admits that when he read Grant's letter, he felt as if he had been slapped in the face by an old friend. Buckner expected courtesy. He expected consideration for the friendship they had. He expected the respect due to a senior West Point officer. Instead, he received a cold ultimatum that treated him like a common criminal. Catton discovered that Buckner was so shocked that he asked his officers to read the letter, because he couldn't believe he had understood it correctly. And when his officers confirmed it, when they confirmed that Grant had indeed sent a demand for unconditional surrender, the reaction was one of absolute shock. One of the Confederate officers wrote in his diary that day, "Today we discovered that we are not fighting against gentlemen. We are fighting against a new kind of soldier, a kind that respects no traditions, respects no courtesy, respects nothing except total victory." And this realization that Grant represented something completely new, something relentless, something that could not be negotiated or reasoned with, spread through the Confederate Army like wildfire. Bruce Catton describes the immediate and long-term consequences of that 28-word response, and the impact was far beyond what anyone could have imagined. First immediate consequence: 15,000 Confederate soldiers surrendered immediately, without conditions, without negotiations, without military dignity. It was the largest capture of troops in the war up to that point, and it set a terrifying precedent. Grant did not take honorable prisoners, he took completely subjugated prisoners. Second consequence: Nashville fell without a single shot being fired. Because when the Confederate troops defending Nashville learned about Fort Donelson, when they learned about the unconditional surrender, they simply abandoned the city overnight. The industrial heart of the South was exposed, and Grant had achieved this with 28 words. Third consequence: Grant earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant in the newspapers, and Lincoln finally found his general. Catton reveals that when Lincoln learned of Grant's response, he said, "Finally, a general who understands that this is a war, not a medieval tournament." But Catton documents much deeper consequences. The Confederate Army was never the same after Fort Donelson. The confidence, the feeling that they were fighting among gentlemen, the belief that they could negotiate an honorable peace, all of that evaporated in those 27 minutes. Grant had broken not just a military fortress, but the spirit of chivalry that held the Confederacy together. Confederate generals began to make decisions based on the fear of facing Grant. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Nathan Bedford Forrest all adjusted their strategies, knowing that if they were captured by Grant, there would be no mercy, no negotiation, there would only be total surrender. And worldwide, European military officers studied Grant's letter with fascination and horror. The concept of unconditional surrender spread through the military academies of Europe, and fundamentally changed how wars would be fought for the next 150 years. Catton showed through diplomatic documents that England and France, who were considering recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation, completely changed their positions after Fort Donelson. They realized that Grant represented a new type of war, a total war that did not respect political or diplomatic borders. And personally, Grant discovered something about himself in those 27 minutes. He discovered that when he eliminated hesitation, when he eliminated kindness, when he eliminated everything but pure determination, he became invincible. In the next 2 years, Grant would apply this same brutal philosophy at Vicksburg, where he besieged an entire city until the population was starving to death, at Chattanooga, where he destroyed an entire Confederate army in just 3 days, and finally against Robert E. Lee, where he fought a war of attrition that cost 65,000 Union casualties, but forever destroyed Confederate military power. 27 minutes, a 28-word letter, and the course of American and world history changed forever. Bruce Catton spent decades researching this story, had access to documents no one else saw, and his final conclusion is stunningly simple. Grant was not just a general, he was the inventor of modern warfare, a war where there are no gentlemen, only winners and losers, and where winning justifies any method necessary. And it all began with those 27 minutes in a freezing tent in Tennessee, when a man who had failed at everything in life decided he would never be kind again when victory was within his grasp.